What if the most powerful army in the world vanished in an instant, without a trace? Sounds like a scene from a blockbuster, right? But this isn't fiction. It's one of the Bible's greatest miracles. Today, we're diving into the mystery of Pharaoh's army at the Red Sea. How did they disappear so completely? And what does that mean for your impossible situations? Stick around, because this story might just change the way you see your own battles. The army of Pharaoh wasn't just any army, it was the army. Think of it like today's superpowers, only instead of stealth bombers and tanks, they had chariots and archers that struck fear into everyone. These guys weren't messing around. They were a force to be reckoned with, built on centuries of conquest. You'd think they were invincible, like that one sock in your laundry that always seems to survive. Where does the other one go? Honestly, if the Egyptians had been up against the mystery of disappearing socks, maybe they would have understood what was coming next. But of course, we're talking about a much grander disappearing act. So what happened? How does an entire army, the pride of Egypt, with its gold-plated chariots and elite soldiers, vanish in a matter of minutes? Hold on, we'll get to that. But first, let's set the stage for this mystery. Now imagine yourself in ancient Egypt, standing on the edge of a massive palace. Pharaoh's forces are lined up, thousands of chariots shimmering in the desert sun, ready for war. It's a sight so powerful that anyone who sees it can feel the earth shake. And yet, poof, just like that, they're gone. I know what you're thinking. This is starting to sound like a bad magic show. But no, this was real. This was God doing something extraordinary that not even Pharaoh's magicians could comprehend. It's like watching one of those sports dynasties crumble overnight. One minute, they're winning championships. The next, poof, they miss the playoffs for the next 10 years. It feels like the same thing is happening with Pharaoh's forces. You have this unstoppable juggernaut of an army chasing a group of ragtag Israelites into the wilderness. Pharaoh probably thought, this is easy. They don't even have weapons. But little did he know, the Israelites had something more powerful, divine intervention. And that is what changes everything. But let's pause for a moment. Picture yourself as an Israelite, having just fled Egypt after hundreds of years in slavery. You're running for your life, and behind you is the mightiest army in the world. Can you imagine the fear? It's like being stuck in a horror movie where the villain just won't stop chasing you. It's every bad decision rolled into one. You've got no escape. On one side, the churning waters of the Red Sea, and on the other, Pharaoh's army breathing down your neck. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place. But here's where it gets good. In moments like these, when there's no way out, that's when God shows up. And not in some small, whispering way. No, this was dramatic. Very dramatic. Enter Moses. Moses lifts his staff, the wind picks up, and suddenly, whoosh! The waters of the Red Sea begin to part, revealing dry land in the middle of what moments ago seemed like an impassable body of water. You know how sometimes you wish you could just part the sea of traffic during rush hour? Well, that's basically what Moses did, except, more literal. And just like that, the Israelites started walking through. Not just tiptoeing either. They were hurrying. They knew the stakes. Can you imagine being one of them? Every step you take, you look to your left and right, and there's a wall of water towering over you, held back by some unseen force. You're probably thinking, is this really happening? What if this comes crashing down on me? It's that kind of tension where you're both amazed and terrified at the same time. It's like waiting for the other shoe to drop, only the stakes are much higher. And speaking of high stakes, let's flip back to Pharaoh for a second. Now, Pharaoh wasn't one to give up easily. Oh no, he was mad. I mean, this guy had just lost a nation of slaves that helped build his empire. So naturally, when he saw the Israelites escaping through the sea, he thought, if they can walk through, so can we. Cue the ominous music, because this was a bad idea. It's like when you're watching a suspense movie and the character decides to open that door they shouldn't open. You're yelling at the screen, no, don't go in there. But of course they do. And Pharaoh did too. His entire army thundered down into the seabed, chariots and all, chasing after the Israelites. There had to be someone in his ranks who thought, maybe this isn't such a good idea, boss. But Pharaoh's pride wouldn't let him turn back. Pride. It's a dangerous thing, right? Sometimes it drives us right into disaster, just like it drove Pharaoh's army. Now here's where things really pick up. As the last of the Israelites stepped out of the sea onto dry land, Moses lifted his staff once more, and boom! The waters came crashing down like a tidal wave, engulfing Pharaoh's forces. Gone. Just like that. In a blink of an eye, what was once an unstoppable army was now fish food at the bottom of the sea. You can almost hear the collective gasp from the Israelites as they turned around and saw the sea close over their enemies. And the realization hit them. God had just delivered them from certain death. It wasn't just a victory, it was a miracle of epic proportions. And think about it. There's something deeply satisfying about the bad guys getting their comeuppance. It's like the underdog finally wins. Pharaoh's army had the numbers, the power, and all the resources, but they didn't have God, and that's the ultimate lesson here. Sometimes the most powerful forces on earth are no match for divine intervention. Just when you think there's no way out, God makes a way. And the story isn't just about ancient history, it's about today too. I mean, how many times in life do we feel like we're trapped between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army? It could be anything. A toxic job, financial struggles, or even personal failures. You feel stuck, hopeless, like there's no escape, until suddenly the waters part and you see a way forward. God's like, I've got you, don't worry. It's not always obvious at the time, but looking back, you realize he was there, making a path where there seemed to be no path. And let's be honest, sometimes we're like Pharaoh too. We charge ahead with our own plans, full of pride, ignoring the warning signs, only to end up overwhelmed by the very thing we thought we could control. So what's the takeaway here? Maybe it's simple. When God says he's got your back, trust him. Even when the road ahead looks impossible, even when everything's falling apart, trust that he's parting the waters just for you. Now I know what you're thinking, but what about Pharaoh's army? Did they ever resurface? Did anyone find them? Well, that's where it gets even more mysterious. Archaeologists have spent years looking for evidence of the Egyptian army's remains under the Red Sea. There have been reports of chariot wheels, horse bones, and even human remains found in the area where the crossing was believed to happen. But so far, nothing definitive has been discovered. It's almost like God didn't just swallow them up in the water. He erased them from history. Talk about the ultimate disappearing act. It's as if their fate was sealed, both in the physical world and in the spiritual realm. And maybe that's the point. The message isn't just that God can make armies disappear, it's that he can erase the power of anything that stands against his plan. So here we are, thousands of years later, still talking about the army that vanished. Pharaoh thought his might could overpower anything, but what he didn't understand was that God's power isn't about numbers or strength, it's about purpose. And once God sets a purpose in motion, nothing, not even the most powerful army in the world, can stop it. Imagine Pharaoh waking up one morning, stretching like a king who knows he owns everything he sees. The pyramids, the Nile, the endless sands, it's all his. This guy wasn't just any leader, he was the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth at the time. And let's be honest, Pharaoh probably thought he was invincible. I mean, wouldn't you? With an army like his at your disposal? These weren't just foot soldiers with spears. No, Pharaoh had an elite force. We're talking of chariots, the ancient world's equivalent of tanks. Can you imagine that sound? Thousands of chariot wheels grinding against the desert floor. It must have sounded like thunder on a sunny day. Terrifying for anyone standing in their way, for sure. And speaking of chariots, have you ever had a boss who thought they were absolutely unstoppable? You know the type. Marching into meetings, making decisions like they're the Pharaoh of the office. You try to tell them something's a bad idea, but nope, they charge forward anyway. That's exactly what Pharaoh was like, stubborn and overconfident. No one could tell him otherwise. If you had tried to tell him chasing after the Israelites was a bad idea, he would have probably waved you off like, "Do you see my chariots? We've got this!" Let's talk about those chariots for a second. Picture this. Large wooden wheels reinforced with bronze. Soldiers standing firm, holding spears, shields, and bows. It wasn't just about speed, but intimidation. When you saw them coming, you knew you were in trouble. Kind of like when you see that stack of emails in your inbox on a Monday morning. You know it's going to be a rough day. But Pharaoh's army wasn't worried. They had the latest and greatest technology for their time. In fact, if you think of it in modern terms, their chariots were like, oh, I don't know, military Humvees, sleek, fast, and deadly. The Egyptian chariot was a marvel of ancient engineering. 2 horses up front, a charioteer to steer, and a warrior poised with a bow or spear, ready to strike. They could zigzag through battle, hitting enemies from a distance and disappearing before anyone had time to react. Think of it like the ancient version of a hit and run, except, with spears instead of cars. These soldiers were the top dogs, trained to be fast and deadly. And let's be honest, they probably had the confidence to match. I bet the guys in Pharaoh's chariot battalion walked around Egypt like they were rock stars. But here's the thing, when you're at the top for too long, you start to think you're untouchable. Pharaoh? Totally, I thought he was untouchable. He probably believed he could stroll into the Red Sea with his chariots and simply scare the Israelites into submission. I mean, he's done it before, right? The Israelites had been slaves for generations, bending to his every whim. Why should this time be any different? It's that kind of arrogance that gets you into trouble. Ever had a friend who's so stubborn they won't admit they're wrong, even when it's clear as day? That's Pharaoh, charging forward, convinced that nothing could stop him. Now, what Pharaoh didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, was that he wasn't just up against people this time. He was up against God. And spoiler alert, when you're up against God, it doesn't matter how many chariots you have. They could have had the fanciest bronze rims and the smoothest ride. None of that was going to save them from what was about to happen. But let's rewind for a second and talk about the sheer scale of Pharaoh's military. This wasn't just a small battalion. This was an army that had crushed rebellions, conquered territories, and built an empire that stretched across much of the ancient world. You know how in action movies, there's always that one scene where the hero stands on a hill and sees an entire army coming over the horizon? It's meant to make you think, whoa, how is he going to get out of this one? Well, that's exactly what it would have felt like for the Israelites, except this wasn't a movie. This was real. And the stakes? They couldn't have been higher. Pharaoh's army was a massive, well-oiled machine. He had infantry, cavalry, and of course, the pride of his forces, the chariots. These guys were trained from birth to fight, and they were good at it. Think about it. If you grew up knowing that one day you'd be leading a charge in one of these elite chariots, you'd be training day and night. These soldiers were the best of the best, and they had every reason to believe they could win. After all, they'd never been defeated before. They were Egypt, the superpower of the ancient world. But isn't that how pride works? It builds slowly, creeping in, making you believe you're invincible until you're not. Pharaoh was riding high on this sense of invincibility, thinking his chariots would guarantee him victory. And why wouldn't he? Everything he'd ever known, everything he'd ever conquered, told him that he was unstoppable. But this was different. There's a Bible verse in Proverbs that comes to mind. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Pharaoh's story is the ultimate illustration of this. He charged into the Red Sea full of confidence, believing his army would do what it had always done, win. But pride blinds you to the things you can't see, and in this case, Pharaoh didn't see the biggest power at work: God's plan. Let's be real though. Don't we all have our Pharaoh moments? Those times we think we've got everything under control. We've got the plan, the strategy, the backup plan. We're ready for anything. Except life has a funny way of reminding us that we're not as in control as we think. It's like when you prepare for every possible scenario, but then something completely unexpected happens. That's what Pharaoh was walking into. He had no idea what was coming, and yet he charged forward anyway. The sight of those chariots must have been terrifying for the Israelites. But I imagine there were a few soldiers in Pharaoh's army who were thinking, Are we sure about this? Is anyone else getting a bad feeling? I mean, come on, they're charging into a sea that's miraculously parted. At some point, you've got to stop and think, maybe, just maybe, we should rethink this. But when you're riding high on pride, those thoughts don't stand a chance. Pharaoh was all in, convinced his military might would triumph. And that's the crazy part. He was so focused on chasing the Israelites that he missed the signs that something far bigger was happening. It's like watching someone speed through a red light because they're in a rush, completely unaware that disaster's around the corner. And speaking of rushing into things, ever notice how, when we're dead set on something, like Pharaoh was, it's hard to stop? You get tunnel vision, right? You're so locked in on your goal that you don't see the danger. It happens to all of us. Whether it's a project at work, a relationship, or just life in general, sometimes we push ahead thinking, I've got this, only to realize later we were heading straight into trouble. That's exactly what was happening to Pharaoh. He thought he was chasing victory, but in reality, he was walking straight into a trap of his own pride. Because when God decides to act, it doesn't matter how many chariots you've got, your plans are about to change. And that's the thing about Pharaoh's story. It's not just about a man, an army, and a sea. It's about something deeper. It's about how pride blinds us, how overconfidence can lead us to disaster, and how, no matter how powerful we think we are, there's always a force greater than us. Pharaoh didn't get that, not until it was too late. And his elite army, those mighty chariots, well, they were about to learn the same lesson too. So there they were, the Israelites, stuck, trapped between the Red Sea on one side and Pharaoh's elite chariots on the other. I mean, this is one of those moments where you just know someone in the crowd looked around and thought, well, we're doomed. It's like being stuck in traffic, except instead of being frustrated with a dead phone and no music, you've got an army bearing down on you with every intention of wiping you out. Yeah, just a little bit more intense than missing your exit on the highway. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? You're standing there with your family, your kids, maybe a goat or two you managed to bring along for the journey. And in the distance, you see the dust cloud from Pharaoh's chariots getting closer and closer. It's the ultimate oh no moment. Your heart's racing, your hands are sweating, and you're probably giving serious side-eye to Moses like, hey, big guy, anytime now with the miracle. But let's back up a second and really think about this. How many times have we been in situations like that? Maybe not with an actual army chasing us, but stuck between a rock and a hard place, feeling like there's no escape? You know the feeling, right? It's like when you're at work and suddenly realize you've got back-to-back meetings all day and you haven't had coffee yet. Or you're at the grocery store and you get to the checkout only to realize you left your wallet at home. That sinking feeling? Yeah, we've all been there. For the Israelites, though, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was life or death. They just spent 400 years in slavery, finally gotten out, and now it looked like they were about to be wiped out before they even tasted freedom. It's that kind of pressure that makes you question everything. You know, there were folks in that crowd muttering, we should have stayed in Egypt. At least we had food there. Classic panic mode. Isn't it funny how, when things get tough, our brains start glamorizing the past no matter how terrible it was? Like, sure, we were slaves, but at least there was a routine. But here's the kicker. God was setting them up for something huge, something they couldn't even imagine yet. It's like when you're watching a movie and the hero's trapped, no way out, and you're sitting there thinking, how on earth are they gonna get out of this one? The tension is high, but you know deep down, something big is coming. The Israelites didn't know it yet, but they were on the edge of witnessing one of the greatest miracles in history. And let's talk about Moses for a second. This guy is in charge of leading the millions of people, and they're all looking at him like, dude, what's the plan? That's some serious pressure. I mean, imagine being the only person with a GPS and everyone's depending on you to get them out of the wilderness. But instead of a nice, clear path, there's just water, a whole lot of water. Moses had to have been feeling that weight, but instead of panicking, he did what we all should do in impossible situations. He prayed, he trusted, and then He waited. Have you ever been there? You've done all you can do, and now it's just waiting. That's the worst part, isn't it? The not knowing, the wondering if you're about to go under. But it's in those moments, right at the edge of disaster, that faith gets real. Like really real. Moses wasn't just trusting for a little break in traffic or a canceled meeting. He was trusting God to literally move the sea. Talk about a bold prayer. And then it happened. The impossible. The wind started to blow and the waters began to part. Imagine the looks on the Israelites' faces. 1 second they're staring at certain doom, and the next there's a path through the sea. A path through the sea. It's like that one miracle moment we all dream of. The boss calls off the meeting, the traffic clears up, or maybe even that old problem you've been worrying about just resolves itself. But this was on a whole other level. This wasn't just an escape, it was a spectacle. Picture walking through those towering walls of water. On one side you see fish swimming by, maybe a giant octopus just chilling out, watching this bizarre parade of people and livestock walking through what used to be a sea. It must have felt like stepping into a movie, or let's be honest, an aquarium, but without the glass. You'd be nervous, sure, but also in absolute awe of what's happening around you. And let's not forget, this wasn't a quick jog. They had to hurry, but they also had to move millions of people across. That takes time. Every step must have felt like an act of faith. And isn't that what life feels like sometimes? Like you're walking through something miraculous, but you're still nervous, still wondering if everything is going to hold. You're trusting God, but man, it's tough not to glance up at those walls of water and think, is this really happening? Is this really going to work? For the Israelites, though, there was no turning back. The only way out was through. And maybe that's the message for us too. Sometimes in life, the only way out of a tough situation is to keep going. Even when it feels impossible, even when you're walking through the middle of the Red Sea with nothing but faith holding the water back. But don't forget, they could hear Pharaoh's army behind them, the sound of chariots rumbling, horses neighing. It was getting closer. That sound. You can almost hear it now, can't you? Like that deadline creeping up on you, or that problem you've been avoiding getting louder and louder. The pressure's on and time is running out. Yet God had it all under control. The Israelites were right where they needed to be. Sure, it didn't feel that way. It never does when you're in the middle of it. But from God's perspective, it was all part of the plan. Just like in our own lives when things seem to be falling apart, maybe, just maybe, they're actually falling into place. So what happens next? The Israelites are walking through the sea, Pharaoh's army is closing in, and Moses is probably walking faster than anyone. It's that heart-pounding moment when the escape is so close, but danger is breathing down your neck. We've all been there. You're about to make it, but you can still hear the footsteps of trouble behind you. And then, just when you think it's all over, God steps in, big time. And just like that, boom, Moses raises his staff, and the unimaginable happens. The Red Sea, this massive body of water that seemed like an impassable wall trapping the Israelites, suddenly parts. Can you picture it? Water shooting up into the sky on either side, creating this path right down the middle. It must have been the wildest thing anyone there had ever seen. Like imagine being at a pool party and someone just splits the pool in half. Now you've got 2 walls of water standing tall just hanging there. It's like a weird magic trick, but way better. And, you know, it's real. The wind was blowing hard, drying up the sea floor so they could walk across. And not just walk, they had to run. Pharaoh's army wasn't exactly known for taking its sweet time. The Israelites were moving, probably with a few of them glancing back every few steps, eyes wide, thinking, is this for real? And let's be honest, if this happened during your morning commute, you'd be taking pictures. Imagine that. You're stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic, and suddenly the highway splits right down the middle, and there's a clear path for you. What would you do? You wouldn't just sit there. You'd grab your coffee, hit the gas, and go. But back to our scene. The Red Sea has split, and it's epic. The walls of water are towering on both sides. I like to think some people were probably sneaking glances at fish swimming by. Maybe even a whale. Oh hey, there's a dolphin just casually floating beside us. Like where else does that happen? Only in this moment. And if you weren't freaking out about the sea suddenly turning into a road, you were probably in awe of God's power. This wasn't some lucky break. This was divine intervention, straight up. Think about the faith it took for the Israelites to step into that sea. I mean, it's one thing to stand there and see the waters part, but it's a whole other thing to actually walk through it. I bet some of them were hesitant, maybe even thinking, Moses, are we sure about this? What if the water comes crashing down? But that's faith, isn't it? Taking that step, even when it doesn't make sense. Even when everything around you screams, this is impossible. And yet God makes the impossible possible. You've probably had moments like that in life, right? Times when the way forward seemed blocked and you didn't see any path through. Maybe it was a tough decision or a situation where it felt like there were no good options. And then, out of nowhere, something shifted. The situation changed. The path opened up. It wasn't easy, and you might have been a little nervous about stepping into it, but deep down, you knew you had to take that step of faith. That's what the Israelites were doing here. They had no choice but to trust God and walk through what seemed like the craziest escape route ever. And trust me, this wasn't some nice, leisurely stroll either. This was an all-hands-on-deck, grab your kids, grab your stuff, and run kind of moment. Picture the adrenaline pumping through everyone's veins. The water is still towering beside you. Pharaoh's army is coming up fast behind you. There's no time to waste. Every step is a mix of awe and panic, like, okay, this is incredible, but can we please hurry before something goes wrong? And that's where the tension builds. Because let's face it, the Egyptians weren't just going to stand there and let the Israelites walk away. They were coming in hot, chariots thundering behind them. Pharaoh was probably thinking, I've got them now. There's no way they'll make it out of this alive. Little did he know, God had other plans. So here's the scene. You've got the Israelites rushing through the sea, eyes wide, hearts pounding, probably holding on to their kids with one hand and dragging their livestock with the other. Behind them, the thundering of Pharaoh's chariots gets louder and louder. It's a race against time. Every step feels heavier, every breath quicker. But then, there's this shift. The Israelites are making it to the other side, and Pharaoh's forces are getting closer, but somehow you just know this isn't going to end well for Egypt. And that's when it happens. As soon as the last Israelite steps onto dry land, Moses lifts his staff again, and, you guessed it, whoosh. The waters come crashing back down. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a wave come down in a storm, but this was no regular wave. This was a wall of water, like the universe hit the flush button. Pharaoh's army, gone. Just like that. One moment they're charging through, and the next, they're being swallowed by the sea. It's the ultimate disappearing act, but not one that ends with applause. Now let's pause here for a second. Think about the power behind this moment. We're talking about a sea, an entire sea, being controlled by the hand of God. That's not just some random miracle. It's a reminder of how God can move the very elements of nature to protect His people. It's mind-blowing, right? I mean, who else can part the sea, hold it in place for hours, and then crash it back down at the exact right moment? Only God. And here's the spiritual depth. This wasn't just about saving the Israelites physically. It was about showing them and us that when God steps in, nothing is too big. Not the sea, not Pharaoh's army, not even our biggest fears. When we trust Him, He makes a way where there is no way. He parts the waters. He creates paths through the impossible. I don't know about you, but that hits hard. How many times have you felt like you were standing in front of your own Red Sea? The problem seems too big, the way forward blocked, and you're staring at what feels like an impossible situation. And yet in the midst of that, God whispers, trust me, I've got this. The key is in the faith it takes to step into that space. to walk through the parted waters even though it feels risky, even though it feels uncertain. For the Israelites, the Red Sea was a test of faith, and for us, well, maybe we're not parting seas, but we have our own moments where we need to trust that God is making a way. When we're backed up against life's challenges, with no escape in sight, that's when God shows up. Big time. He doesn't always take us around the problem. Sometimes he takes us right through it. So here they were, on the other side. The Israelites had made it. They stood on the shore, probably drenched in sweat, still catching their breath, and just stared. The sea had closed back up, and the threat that had been so terrifying just moments before was now gone. Can you imagine the collective sigh of relief, the pure awe? God had come through in the biggest way possible, and they had witnessed it firsthand. And isn't that just like God? He doesn't just barely get us through. He shows up in ways that leave us speechless. He turns what looks like certain defeat into an unforgettable victory. The Israelites walked through the Red Sea not just to escape Pharaoh, but to see God's power in action. And for us? Well, maybe the Red Sea isn't just a story. It's a reminder that no matter how big the problem, no matter how impossible the situation, God's got this. Now, while the Israelites were celebrating their miraculous escape, let's shift the camera back to Pharaoh and his army for a minute. You'd think, after witnessing a sea literally split in half, the Egyptians might have hit the brakes. Maybe stop for a little team meeting. Something like, guys, maybe chasing these people through a divine miracle isn't the best idea. But nope. Pharaoh, in all his overconfidence, saw that path through the sea and thought, we got this. It's like one of those moments in life where you're in the middle of making a terrible decision, but instead of stopping to rethink it, you just double down. Like when you're at a poker table with a bad hand and you just keep betting, hoping it'll turn around. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Or better yet, when you've ignored the GPS because you know the shortcut, only to find yourself hopelessly lost. Pharaoh was that guy, so locked in on his plan, so sure of his own power, that he couldn't see the disaster looming ahead. So picture this. Pharaoh's chariots are roaring into the seabed, wheels spinning, sand flying. There's probably this huge cloud of dust as they charge forward, completely convinced that they're about to catch the Israelites. I mean, let's be real, Pharaoh wasn't used to losing. In his mind, this was just another round where he'd show his dominance, get back what he lost, and all would be right in the world. The guy thought he was invincible. But here's the thing about pride, it blinds you. It makes you think you're in control, right up until the moment you realize you're not. The Egyptians enter the sea with all the confidence in the world, but there's this tension building. Like when you're watching a thriller and the character walks into the dark, creepy basement and you're just yelling at the screen, "No, don't go in there!" That's Pharaoh's army, charging straight into the Red Sea like it's no big deal. They've got the numbers, they've got the speed, and they've got their eyes locked on the Israelites. But there's this sense, this feeling, that it's all about to go terribly wrong. And speaking of bad decisions, let's make this relatable. How many times have we, in our own lives, been so determined to follow our plan, so sure that we know what's best, that we completely miss the signs? Maybe you've been there. Maybe it was a business deal you were sure was going to be a success, only for it to crash and burn. Or maybe it's a relationship you kept pursuing, even though all the red flags were waving, practically shouting, "Turn back, danger ahead." But no, we double down, we push forward, convinced that we can make it work. And then, like Pharaoh's army, disaster strikes. You see, Pharaoh's downfall wasn't just about military strategy, it was about pride. His ego was so inflated, he believed that no matter what the Israelites had, he could overpower it. And isn't that just how pride works? It makes us believe we're bigger than the challenges in front of us, bigger than the consequences. It makes us think we can charge through any obstacle without a second thought. Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." That verse could have been Pharaoh's motto. He was so sure of himself, so confident in his power, that he couldn't see what was coming. And just like that, His army followed him right into the middle of the sea, completely unaware that this was about to be their last ride. But let's not get too far ahead. For a moment, let's stick with the tension. The Egyptians are charging, horses galloping, wheels spinning, the sound of armor clanking. It must have been deafening. If you were an Israelite still making your way through the sea, hearing that behind you, yeah, you'd be moving fast. But then something starts to shift. Pharaoh's army, so confident just moments ago, begins to realize things aren't quite right. The ground beneath their chariots isn't as solid as it should be. The wheels are getting stuck in the mud, horses are starting to panic, and suddenly, the momentum slows. You can almost hear the murmurs ripple through the ranks. Wait, something's wrong here. But by then, it's too late. They're already in the middle of the sea, trapped. There's no turning back now. And this, my friends, is where overconfidence meets reality. Pharaoh's army is starting to realize they've walked into a trap. But here's the thing. They did it to themselves. Their pride, their refusal to turn back, blinded them to the warning signs. And now as the Israelites step out of the sea on the other side, safe and sound, the Egyptians are stuck, wheels spinning, and the waters begin to stir. And this is the part of the story that makes you sit up a little straighter, lean in a bit more. Because the Egyptians, who moments ago thought they were unstoppable, are suddenly faced with the reality that they're not in control anymore. They never were. And isn't that a spiritual truth we all have to face at some point? No matter how much we plan, no matter how confident we are in our own abilities, we're not in control. Not really. There's a bigger picture at play, and sometimes we're just not seeing it. As the waters start to close in, Pharaoh's army is scrambling, but it's too late. Their confidence is gone, replaced by panic, and you can almost feel it the moment they realize they've lost. That's the thing about pride. It builds us up, tells us we're invincible, until reality comes crashing down. Literally in this case. And that's where the spiritual insight comes in. Pharaoh's story is more than just a historical event. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride. How often do we charge forward, full of confidence in our own strength, only to find ourselves stuck in the middle of a sea we never should have entered? How often do we push ahead, thinking we know better, only to be caught off guard when things start to fall apart? It's a reminder that humility isn't just about being meek, it's about recognizing that we're not the center of the universe. Pharaoh couldn't see that. He couldn't admit that maybe, just maybe, he was in over his head. And that's what ultimately led to his downfall. So as the waters came crashing down, as Pharaoh's once mighty army was swallowed up by the sea, there was a lesson being written into history. A lesson that pride, no matter how powerful it makes us feel, always leads to a fall. And the louder our ego, the bigger the crash. For Pharaoh, that crash was literal. But for us, it's a spiritual warning. To step back, to humble ourselves before we end up stuck in a situation we can't escape from. And maybe, just maybe, to listen when life or God whispers, turn back, before it's too late. And then it happened. That moment where everything shifted. The waters, which had stood tall and calm just moments before, started to move, slowly at first, but you could feel it. The tension building in the air, like when a storm's about to hit. Pharaoh's army, stuck in the middle of the seabed, suddenly found themselves in the worst possible spot. You know that sinking feeling you get when a plan you were sure about starts to fall apart? Yeah, that's exactly what was happening to them. Except instead of a missed deadline or a bad meeting, they were about to get hit by the ultimate wave. Can you picture it? The first rumble of the waters as they began to close in. Maybe it started with a ripple, just enough to make everyone glance around like, is it just me, or is the sea moving? And then the realization hits. This isn't just a ripple, it's the whole sea coming back. You could almost hear the collective gulp from Pharaoh's soldiers. Now here's where it gets intense. The waters didn't just gently return to their original place. Oh no. This was like the universe saying, okay, show's over. Time to close up shop. The walls of water came crashing down faster than anyone could react. It's like one of those magic tricks where the magician makes something disappear, but this time, There's no applause, just silence. Pharaoh's army, the pride of Egypt, vanished beneath the waves in an instant. 1 second they were there, chariots, horses, soldiers, and the next, gone, like they'd never existed. The ultimate disappearing act. And let's be honest, we've all had moments where we wish we could disappear like that, right? Maybe not underwater, but in those times when everything goes wrong and you just want to slip away unnoticed. Ever had a presentation that went south fast and you're standing there thinking, please, just let me disappear? Or when you send that text to the wrong person and you immediately wish the ground would open up and swallow you whole? Yeah, Pharaoh's army wasn't the only one with disappearing dreams. But here's the thing about this particular disappearing act. It wasn't just some accident. This was God's plan in action. And when God steps in, it's not a small thing. It's not just about getting by or squeaking through. It's about making a statement. And this was a statement if there ever was one. Now imagine being one of the Israelites, standing safely on the shore, watching this unfold. You've just walked through the middle of the sea, something you never thought was possible. And now you're seeing your greatest enemy, the very thing that had terrified you, be erased before your eyes. Can you picture the mix of emotions? Relief, awe, probably a little bit of, did that just happen? It's like when you've been dreading something for weeks, maybe an exam, a tough conversation, and then suddenly it's over. And not only did you get through it, the problem just vanished completely. That's a pretty amazing feeling. But let's bring it back to us for a second. Ever had a plan go so wrong that you just wished you could undo the whole thing? Pharaoh's army was in the middle of what they thought was a perfect plan. They were chasing the Israelites. They were going to recapture them, bring them back to Egypt, and restore their dominance. It was supposed to be a slam dunk, but sometimes things don't go as planned. In fact, sometimes they go so wrong, you're left wondering what in the world just happened. We've all been there, haven't we? Maybe it's a business venture you were sure was going to take off, only to watch it crash and burn. Or maybe it's that moment when you're trying to fix something at home, and the more you try to fix it, the worse it gets, until suddenly you're calling a professional, hoping they don't laugh at the mess you've made. Pharaoh's army had the same problem. They thought they were in control, they thought they could handle it, but in the end, their plan unraveled in the most spectacular way. And let's be real for a minute. How many times in life have we tried to force something to happen, only to have it blow up in our faces? It's a lesson in humility. Sometimes we charge into things, convinced we can make it work by sheer willpower, only to find ourselves in the middle of a disaster we didn't anticipate. Pharaoh's soldiers, they were in the middle of a literal disaster. But the principle's the same. Overconfidence leads us into situations we're not prepared for. And before we know it, we're underwater, metaphorically speaking. There's a verse in Proverbs that says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death." Pharaoh's army thought they were on the right path. They were confident, charging forward, but they didn't see the bigger picture. They didn't realize that their plan, no matter how strong it seemed, was about to come crashing down, just like the waters of the Red Sea. But let's not miss the deeper spiritual message here. The Red Sea closing wasn't just about erasing an enemy. It was about showing that when God delivers you from something, He delivers. It's not a halfway victory. When He makes a way for you, it's complete. Pharaoh's army wasn't going to show up again a few months later. They were gone. Period. God didn't just rescue the Israelites. He erased the threat completely. And that's what God does in our lives too, doesn't He? When He moves, He doesn't leave loose ends. When He delivers us from something, whether it's a struggle, a habit, or a fear, He takes care of it completely. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have to walk through some seas ourselves. It doesn't mean there won't be moments where we feel like we're in over our heads. But when God says He's got us, He means it. He's not leaving us halfway through the journey. So as the waters crashed down and Pharaoh's army disappeared, it wasn't just about survival for the Israelites. It was about knowing deep down that God had shown up for them in the biggest way possible. They didn't just escape, they were free. And that freedom, it came from trusting God when it seemed like there was no way out. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, I could use a Red Sea moment in my life right about now, trust me, we've all been there. Sometimes it feels like the problems just keep chasing us down, no matter how far we run. But just like the Israelites, we've got to remember, God's got this. Even when the enemy seems too close, even when the sea looks like an impassable barrier, He's already made a way. We just have to trust that when the waters part, He'll take care of the rest. And when those waters come crashing back down, whatever was chasing you, well, let's just say it won't be around anymore. So there you have it. The waters came crashing down, Pharaoh's army was gone, and the Israelites were left standing on the other side, probably just staring at the sea like, did that really just happen? It must have been surreal, right? One moment, they were facing certain doom, and the next, their enemies were literally wiped away. But here's where the real lesson comes in. It wasn't just about escaping. It was about what God was showing them and us. Spiritually, this story is huge. It's a reminder that what looks like defeat, what feels like the absolute end, is often just the middle of God's plan. Think about it. The Israelites were trapped, no way forward, no way back, and God shows up in a way they couldn't have even imagined. That's how God works sometimes. We're stuck, we're tired, we're looking at the problem thinking, there's no way out. But God, He's already planning the escape. He's already setting up the miracle. And I know, sometimes life doesn't feel that miraculous. Sometimes it feels like you're still stuck in front of the sea, waiting for it to part, while the problems, your own Pharaoh's army, are closing in. It's that moment when you're dealing with a challenge that feels bigger than you, whether it's a personal issue, a financial crisis, or maybe even something spiritual. You're looking for a way out, but all you see are waves. Been there, right? But here's the thing. Just like with the Israelites, what looks like an impossible situation is often the setup for something much bigger. I mean, look at how the story played out. Pharaoh's army, completely erased. That thing that seemed so unstoppable was gone in an instant, and not just defeated, erased. No more looking over their shoulders, no more living in fear of being dragged back into slavery. And God did it in a way that left no room for doubt about who was in control. It's kind of like those times in life when something seems to go horribly wrong, but later you look back and realize it was all part of a bigger plan. Maybe you didn't get that job you wanted, but it led to something even better. Maybe a relationship ended, and at the time it felt like the end of the world. But now you see it was for the best. God has this way of turning what feels like defeat into a setup for victory. And not just any victory, a victory that leaves no question about His hand in it. That's what's so powerful about this story. It wasn't just about getting out of Egypt. It was about showing the Israelites that God had their backs, even when they couldn't see a way forward. And how many times in our lives do we need that reminder that God is making a way, even when it feels like we're at a dead end? Sometimes we're standing at the edge of our own Red Seas with no idea how we're going to move forward. But God, well, God's already parting the waters. So what does this mean for us today? It means that whatever battle you're facing, no matter how overwhelming it seems, God is in control. It might feel like you're trapped between a rock and a hard place, but that's often when God does His best work. When we're at the end of our strength, that's when His strength takes over. And that's not just some feel-good platitude, it's truth. The Bible is full of these moments where people thought all was lost, only for God to show up in a big way. The Red Sea is just one example. Think about your own life for a second. Where's your Red Sea? What's that thing in front of you that seems impossible to overcome? Is it a relationship struggle? A financial burden? Maybe it's a battle with your own insecurities or doubts. We all have them. Those moments where we're just staring at the problem, feeling stuck, feeling like there's no way through. But the Red Sea reminds us that God is always making a way, even when we can't see it yet. And here's the best part. God doesn't just make a way for you to scrape by. He makes a way that leads to the freedom. Just like the Israelites, when He parts the waters, He's not just rescuing you from the immediate danger, He's setting you up for a future without that threat hanging over you. When God moves, He moves completely. It's not a halfway solution, It's a total deliverance. That's what happened to the Israelites, and that's what can happen in our lives too. Now, I'm not saying it's always easy. Walking through the parted sea still takes courage. It still takes faith. I mean, the Israelites had to step onto that dry ground and trust that the walls of water wouldn't collapse on them. And sometimes we have to take those steps of faith too, trusting that God's got this, even when it feels uncertain. But here's what we know from this story. When God makes a way, he also holds the way open. He didn't part the sea and then leave the Israelites to figure it out on their own. He stayed with them every step of the way, holding back the waters until they were safely across. That's who God is. So, the next time you're feeling overwhelmed by life's challenges, just remember the Red Sea moment. It's a reminder that no matter how impossible things seem, God can and will make a way. He's not leaving you stuck between the waves and the army. He's already preparing your escape, even if you don't see it yet. And when he moves, you better believe it's going to be big. I mean, look at what he did for the Israelites. They went from being trapped and terrified to standing on the other side, watching their greatest enemy disappear. That's what God does. He takes what looks like defeat and turns it into victory. And that victory isn't just for the Bible, it's for us too. It's for every one of us standing on the edge of our own Red Seas, wondering how we're going to make it through. The Red Sea story isn't just ancient history, it's a picture of God's power in our lives today. It's a reminder that no matter what we're facing, God's got a plan. And that plan? Well, it might just blow your mind, so take heart. Whatever battle you're facing, whatever sea you're staring at, just remember, God's already parted the waters. You just have to trust him and walk through. Because on the other side of that sea, that's where the victory's waiting. So here we are, at the end of this epic journey through the Red Sea. The Israelites are standing on the shore, and Pharaoh's army? Well, they're not standing anywhere. Gone. Vanished beneath the waves in what might be the worst disappearing act in history. I bet if Pharaoh could have seen what was coming, he'd be rethinking a few of his life choices. That's one disappearing act he definitely wished had a different ending. But seriously, can you imagine the sense of relief the Israelites must have felt? The enemy that had haunted them for generations, wiped away in an instant. But let's bring this home. What's the lasting impact of this story, not just for the Israelites, but for us today? Because here's the thing, this isn't just some ancient tale to dust off and admire. It's relevant, like really relevant. This story is about more than just a sea parting or an army disappearing. It's about faith, trust, and the realization that no matter how impossible things look, God can always make a way. And let's be real, we could all use a little Red Sea miracle in our lives from time to time. So what does this look like for us? What's your Red Sea? Maybe you're standing on the edge of something right now, an impossible situation where you feel stuck, surrounded by problems, and you don't see a way out. Maybe it's a financial crisis, a broken relationship, a health issue. Whatever it is, it feels big, unmovable, like those towering walls of water. But here's the good news. Just like with the Israelites, God's got a plan. Even when it feels like there's no way forward, he's already working on your behalf. And that's the beauty of faith, isn't it? Trusting in something we can't always see. Trusting that even when it looks like we're surrounded by our own Pharaoh's army, God's still got this. Just like he made a way for the Israelites. He's making a way for you. Maybe it doesn't happen in the timing we want. Maybe the waves don't part as quickly as we'd like. But when God moves, it's undeniable. It's powerful, and it's complete. Now, I want to hear from you. What's that Red Sea you're facing? What's that impossible situation you're up against? Drop a comment below, share your story. Maybe you're on the other side of your miracle, and you can encourage someone who's still waiting for their waters to part. Or maybe you're in the middle of it, wondering how you're going to get through. Let's talk about it. We're all in this together. And hey, sometimes just sharing your struggle is the first step towards seeing a breakthrough. You never know who's going to relate to your story and find hope in it. And if you've ever faced something that felt impossible, but then saw God come through in a big way, I want to hear those stories too. Those are the moments that remind all of us, that God's in the business of making a way where there seems to be no way. Your story could be the encouragement someone else needs to hear today. And really, isn't that what we're called to do? Lift each other up, share our testimonies, and remind each other that God is faithful, always. Let's take a moment to bring this story into our everyday lives. Think about the world we live in right now. There's a lot of chaos, a lot of uncertainty. It's easy to feel like we're standing at the edge of a sea of problems, wondering how in the world we're supposed to move forward. But the Red Sea reminds us that no matter how bad things look, no matter how overwhelming the situation feels, God can and will make a way. Whether it's in your personal life, your community, or even on a global scale, God is still parting seas. He's still defeating pharaohs. He's still delivering his people from the impossible. And let's be honest, sometimes we are a pharaoh, aren't we? Sometimes we're the ones holding on too tightly to our own plans, chasing after things that are slipping away, refusing to see that maybe God has a different path for us. And when we don't let go, we get swept up by the very waves we thought we could control. Pride does that. Overconfidence does that. But the beauty of this story is that it's not just about avoiding Pharaoh's fate. It's about stepping into the freedom that comes when we trust God's way over our own. So here's my challenge to you. Take a step back. Reflect. Where are you chasing after your own plans like Pharaoh when you should be trusting God's lead? And where are you standing at the edge of the Red Sea, waiting for God to move? Because he will move. He always does. The key is trusting him enough to take that first step, even when the waters haven't parted yet. As we wrap up, let's remember that this isn't just a story about an ancient army and a sea. It's a story about faith, trust, and the incredible power of God's intervention in our lives. And it's a story that's still playing out today. So whatever you're facing, whether you're feeling like an Israelite standing at the shore, or maybe even like Pharaoh chasing after something you should have let go, know that God's got this. He's got you. And just like he parted the waters for his people, he'll part the waters in your life too. So next time you're facing something impossible, remember Pharaoh's army. Remember that they didn't make it out, but the Israelites did. And that's the promise we hold on to today. God delivers. He always delivers. Now let's see what Red Sea he's about to part in your life. So here's where it gets real. You've heard the story of the Red Sea. You've seen how God can turn the impossible into a victory, but now it's your turn. What's your Red Sea? What's that big challenge in your life that feels unmovable, like you're standing on the shore, unsure how you're going to get through? Drop a comment below and share your story. Whether it's something you've already overcome or something you're still walking through, let's build a community of encouragement right here. Your story could inspire someone else who's feeling stuck, and you never know. Your breakthrough could be just the thing someone else needs to believe their own is coming. And if this message has spoken to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on more conversations like this. Let's walk through these Red Sea moments together, knowing that when we trust God, the waters always part.